Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Scott Litke, the director of the Institute for Holocaust Education. Welcome to our monthly third Thursday IHE Lunch and Learn. I say the same thing every month as far as how fortunate we are to have our presenter. This time even more so. We have Dr. Adina Newman. Adina and I go back probably 13, 14, 15 years ago to Alexandria, Virginia, when I was a religious school director, and Adina was one of my amazing teachers. And so I've been watching her career since we both left the area. Adina is the founder and director at My Family Genie, and she assists clients with research and blogs about genealogy. She's the co-founder of the DNA Reunion Project, which is the main thing we're going to
The
talk
Holocaust Reunion Project.
Holocaust, excuse me,
Yes.
Reunion Project, and is a professional genealogist, specializing in Jewish genealogy, genetic genealogy, social media. She has received international social media attention, lots of very interesting social media attention. Just ask Alec Baldwin. And her research with genealogy and celebrities is often featured on many many Instagram posts. So I turn it over to you.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. So let's do this. And then from beginning, it's going to work for me. Enable, you're good. Okay, can we all see this? Yes, great. So I call this presentation L'Ador Vador, using DNA to reunite Holocaust survivors, because I think DNA is the ultimate kind of generation to generation piece, because we are a lot of times we are trying to help survivors, but also a lot of times we're helping through their descendants or other people related to them. So I think you'll have a better sense of what I'm talking about. But so I'm going to go ahead and kind of talk about my journey into this career, basically, but just helping people, because it didn't start that way. So I am a genealogist, and a lot of people ask me how I got into it, and there are lots of answers for it, but I grew up in a home where, especially my mother's side of the family, would talk a lot about the family history, and there's a lot of older generations in my family. So it was like, I remember this and back then, and so a lot of that. So you may have pieces of paper like this in your home, kind of the chicken scratch family trees. I have several of these papers. I have no idea who Bob Overly is, and they think it's funny that they just crossed it out. But my mother, I believe, might have written this from her aunt. So my aunt was the keeper of the family history. My gut is, and because I see this so often, is everybody has that person in their family who is kind of the keeper of all the family history and sometimes secrets or just records. So this was my great aunt Mim, was the person who did that. And she would tell us a lot about my Bubby's family, my mother's family. And this is one of those sheets. So this one in particular talks a lot about the Ilyansky family. And basically the story of the Ilyansky family is this was my great-grandfather brother. So my mother's maternal grandfather's brother, and just everything about his family. So they were wealthy. They were in the bookbinding business in Riga, Latvia. In World War I, they had to go, they had to flee, and they went to in Estonia, which is now Tartu. And just all the people, all the names in the family. And you can see it's even, they wrote Ilyansky in Hebrew. His name was Osha, his wife, 4 sons, 3 daughters. I mean, a lot of stuff was here. And basically we get to the present day and you say, okay, who are the Ilyanskys? What happened to them? And my mother, nobody has a clue. People just know this story, but we don't know what happened to them. So when I got into genealogy, I immediately kind of wanted to figure out what happened to my Ilyansky family, among other things. So I was very fortunate that in Jewish genealogy, some places where people settle are more easily accessible than others. And fortunately, Estonia is one of those great places to do some research. And I started researching this family. And, I found some of the people in this picture here. Jenny Sack, for example, Jenny Ilyansky Sack, unfortunately, she perished in the Holocaust, and her children and her husband. Hilda, we believe, also perished. There's no testimony for her, but there's kind of a last residence, and that's it for her. So we found that a lot of the members of this family perished in the Holocaust. But, we wanted to find out if there were any survivors. So, when I first got into this, it was basically that typical traditional genealogy, which we sometimes call paper trail genealogy. And what that just means is I'm using records and databases and finding, different pieces to put the puzzle together. So there was, I don't know if it exists anymore, but there was a database through the Estonian Jewish Museum. And I just typed in Ilyansky and I found a lot of information, particularly about David Ilyansky. And of course, it says he was born in Riga, and I believe I've found his birth certificate since then. And it talks a little bit about his history, and I found a lot of the records pertaining to him. And David, of course, was one of the people on my great aunt Mim's list. You can see that he was a doctor, a medic. He had Soviet citizenship in 1935. It has parents' names that, we don't know what happened there. Maybe he had a false identity because he survived the Holocaust. And I started pulling all this stuff together. And it's a lesson, an important lesson in genealogy is you really need to really, really analyze every record you have, because you don't know what information in a record is going to be helpful. Most of the time, people are just looking at maybe the parents' names or the date of birth or where they're born, but I should have been looking at the source, where it came from. So as you can see here, it says the source of marriage here for the marriage with Dina Gelman is MyHeritage. And that David died in 1965. Okay, MyHeritage, if you're not familiar with it, is a database where you can have lots of family trees. There's lots of records there, kind of like Ancestry. It's comparable. And so I went to MyHeritage and found a tree with all these people. Now, if you find somebody with a family tree that has people who kind of match your people, you may be related to them, because people tend to put people in a tree because they mean something to them. So I looked for the source of that tree, and it was somebody, it was all in Cyrillic, it was all in Russian, but I saw that the person lived in Israel. So I took a stab at writing in Hebrew to them, being hopeful. And so I'll let you know what kind of happened from that. So from all of this, with that, David's on the left, and his brother Solomon, also in my list, is on the right. You can see they kind of look alike there. And you can see the David photo. It's actually a passport photo. Again, lots of things are possible from archives. I'll tell you how I got the right photo in a second. But basically, I knew people survived. So this tree I found connected these people. So I was really, really excited, and I reached out to them. And what happened is that I didn't get a message back from MyHeritage. I got an email, because I gave them my personal email, from a gentleman named Igor Ilyansky. And he said to me, you wrote to my cousins in Israel, because he speaks English. You wrote to my cousins in Israel. How do you know about my family? What's your story? And I explained to him that you and my mother are second cousins, that your grandfather and my mother's grandfather were brothers. And he was floored because he is the son of Solomon, that survived, and the people in Israel were the children of David. So basically what happened is, a lot of times you might find in Jewish genealogy is that, people have different last names. So in my family, the original last name was Shtikin, but my great-grandfather decided to go with Michelson. The story goes that, it was to avoid the Tsar's army, but we're not sure if it was for him or for somebody else, but they became Michelson, but we always knew the source was Shtikin. With the Ilyanskys, because my Aunt Mim knew this, she said, oh, when the big brother Osher married, he took his wife's name, which was Ilyansky. This is Igor, his name's Joseph. Joseph didn't know that story. So he'd been spending his whole life looking for Ilyanskys. So again, this is a reunion. He's since done a DNA test. He matches the family accordingly as a second cousin. We are trying to find other survivors within the family. There's a branch that fled to Argentina. Unfortunately, they have the very wonderful common name of Goldberg. So we've been trying to find them, and we've been just trying to find other members of this family. So but again, I'm trying to show that there's a lot possible, because there is a kind of there's a belief that pervades the Holocaust survivor community in particular, but I think Jewish genealogy as well, is that there's no records to be had. Everything was destroyed. Don't bother looking, because you'll just be disappointed. And something I really want to elucidate is that's just not the case. There are so many records to be had. The Nazis did not systematically destroy records. That's not a thing. Actually, we have a lot of records because they created new records. So, the first kind of myth we try to bust is please look, because I wouldn't have known about this in this case unless I had started to dig. Here, Joseph, I've met him once in person. We correspond a lot email. He lives in Brooklyn. He had bags and bags of clothes of his daughter, and he wanted to get rid of his daughters, and he wanted to get rid of them. So he drove 5 hours to my house, dropped off the bags with his daughter, took a nice picture, and drove home. So, sometimes if you find relatives, they'll give you hand-me-downs for your children. So that's kind of how I got into this. It was also a lesson of, I am not the descendant of a Holocaust survivor. My family came in the early 1900s. The one came in the late 1800s. And so I grew up thinking that the Holocaust was something that happened to the Jewish people, but not necessarily in my family. Quickly, when I started doing this, I learned that that's not true, that it just depends on which generation. So once I started getting into this, I learned that my great-grandparents had siblings that were murdered in the Holocaust, and they're survivors, all over the world. So again, even if you are Jewish, you probably have somebody in your family who was a victim of the Holocaust. You just haven't found it yet. So now let's talk about DNA, because I'm a genetic genealogist. That's somebody who uses DNA with the genealogy to work on this. So what is genetic genealogy? It's not complicated. I do not have a science degree by any stretch. I find actually that a lot of geneticists have no idea how to do any of this. But it's basically taking those commercial direct-to-consumer DNA tests and taking the traditional genealogical methods, building a tree, finding records to figure out relationships. So you're going to take DNA matches and put them in a known family tree. That's what most of us tend to do. But a lot of times we deal with things like unknown parentage in the tree, or actually taking a DNA test proves that somebody's, father or grandfather or whatever it is was not who they thought. So DNA can be the only way to identify biological family. It's really wonderful for finding lost branches in the tree. I found plenty. Sometimes the paper trail can't provide answers, because sometimes records were destroyed, not systematically, but war happens. And for example, we've had cases of Warsaw, and they got bombed a lot. So there's a lot of records missing for that time period. So sometimes DNA can be the only way to solve that. So when we use genealogy, commonly we're using autosomal DNA. There's different kinds of DNA. There's autosomal, Y, and mitochondrial. A commercial autosomal DNA test, they're all the ones, people always say, what blood do I have to give? But they're just saliva based, whether you're spitting into a tube or a swab. And where it gets its name is this is a basic science lesson, is kind of as much as I understand in science, but we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Most people have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and 22 pairs are called the autosomes. The 23rd pair is the sex chromosomes of X, Y. And basically how this works is when you become when you're conceived, you get 50% of each parent's DNA, but they can pass on, a different smorgasbord, so to speak, of their DNA, which is why you don't look exactly like your sibling. What autosomal DNA can do is they tell us about recent ancestry. It's not really exciting for people who are Ashkenazi Jewish. I'm 100% reliably. But it also says how much DNA we share with each other. And again, when I'm talking about autosomal DNA tests, I'm talking about the ancestries. Hopefully the 23andMe's will still be around in the next few months. MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA. These are autosomal tests. So how it works when we talk about how DNA gets passed down is, for example, you look at the on the far left, you can see that the box person is comprised of their mom and dad, and then the circle is comprised of their mom and dad. So when they have a child, there's a different, what's called recombination of the DNA that makes you. So you can see that the square passed down basically 50-50 of each grandparent, but the purple green passed down, when the circle passed down like 60-40. So even though you get 50% of your DNA from each parent, there's no guarantee you get exactly 25% from each grandparent. That's where it gets to be completely random. So you can see as you keep passing down, you can see on the right side too, you have a different assortment effectively of DNA inheritance. And what we're looking for when we do these DNA tests and look at matches is we're looking for the segments in common. IBD segment means identical by descent. We'll get into endogamy shortly, but we're basically seeing how much is that orange. So in this case, we would expect, how are these people related, right? So we have the parents and then the children, and these are first cousins. So we expect first cousins to share in a certain way, but they don't share in the exact same way. So I have many first cousins. I share DNA, different amounts of DNA with them based on how we all inherited. So when you take a test like Ancestry, and I will say, people say, where do I test first? And we always recommend Ancestry for a lot of reasons. One is, the biggest is that it's the largest database. So you have the best chance of finding DNA matches. We also find that they're the most user-friendly compared to others. I mean, I like a lot of other sites, but I find this to be very user-friendly compared to others. They have trees involved. You can, do color coding and notes and things like that. But also, Jews deal with a phenomenon called endogamy, which basically just means that we are related to each other many times over, and it affects the DNA. So we get inflated amount of, the measurement is called centimorgans. You can see next to some of these numbers, there's cm. So we get an inflated amount once you get more distant. So you could have people that the program says your second cousin or third cousin usually, and they're not, you can't find any relationship because the segments aren't such that you share from a recent common ancestor. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. So this is the matches. These are my matches. I'm very fortunate that I've had my parents test. So I mostly use mine just for educational purposes because I only inherited 50% from each parent. So as you can imagine, using mom's to find her side, using dad's to find his side is much more worth my time because there's 50% they didn't give to me. So I try to, you want to use the oldest generations as often as possible. You can also see that I have a half uncle there, which I'll talk about, a first cousin, and I labeled these myself because I know how I'm related to them. I have a first cousin once removed, a half first cousin, and these are all the amounts I share with them. So the only one that's pretty consistent are parents. And again, it's, it's kind of room for error, but you effectively share about 3,400 to 3,500 with each parent. And that's the only time you're going to get a number like that is if, you accidentally tested twice or you have an identical twin. So those are pretty reliable. As you can see, when you get to close family, the 1,045 and the 964 are not so different. So there's no magic number that tells you exactly how much you're related to that person. There's a range. So a full first cousin shares in the same range as a half uncle. So you have to start doing your, typical genealogy. That's why I say it's not just about the DNA, it's about building back and figure out how everyone else is related to each other. You can see the same thing. I have a first cousin once removed and a half first cousin that actually share the same thing, the same amount, 647, but they're related to me in different ways. So it's a range. So what happens is if you have a family tree and, if you know your family tree, you should be working on that first before you do DNA. That's what I recommend. Because if you have a well-developed family tree, when you get more distant matches, you can figure out how they fall into them. So for example, you'll see, I mentioned that surname Sticken before. It's not very common, but that is a match. And I know based on my tree that I've worked many hours on, I know how she fits in my tree. She originally tested at this is a third-party site called GEDmatch, and she originally tested at Family Tree DNA, and she shares, you know, I think she is my, I want to say I can't remember, it might be my third cousin wants to move twice over because my mom's grandparents are first cousins. So we know how we share with each other. So matches that you have start to make sense if you have a tree. However, right, so here, this is what we believe is the Shticken family. We believe my second great grandfather is in the middle. We believe that I think it is her second great grandfather, is to the right of him, and that they were brothers. So this is kind of a family heirloom that we believe was taken in Dvinsk at some point. We're not 100% sure. We're still trying to piece all of this together, but this is, you know, this is our Shticken family. So I know how she fits in with it. But sometimes you can't. So I showed you before that I have a half uncle. What is a half uncle, you might ask, if you're not aware? It means that one of my grandparents is their parent, not both. So when I first got into this, I had what we called at the time NPEs, non-parental events, or MPEs, misattributed parentage. And it means that there were matches in my tree that didn't make sense. So I matched everyone I was supposed to, but the people I matched with were not matching who they were supposed to because they had surprised Jewish. I tell this story, but I had one match on the site 23andMe who was a quarter Jewish, and we couldn't figure it out, and they wouldn't get back to me after the first time. So I said, you know what, maybe they tested on Ancestry, because you never know where people are going to test. So I tested on Ancestry. I said, aha, more non-Jewish relatives that are also part Jewish. And I checked, and on 23andMe, it was connected to my mother's side, but on Ancestry, it was my mother's father's side. So I discovered a whole other mystery, and I could write a book on just this. But basically, you know, after applying all the things I learned that the gentleman next to me here is my Uncle Larry, whom I love dearly, because my grandfather, it was an 80-year-old secret. So my grandfather is his father. There were some people who apparently knew about it, but he never knew about it. So he has a whole new family and his son had tested. And this is kind of what genetic genealogy does. We wouldn't have known this. There's no paper trail. I think he had a family member who knew about this, but there was no record that said who his biological father was. He grew up thinking the person on paper was his father, although he always suspected something. It wasn't until DNA I shared as a half first cousin. You saw I had a half first cousin. That is his son. I figured out how I was related to him by talking to other relatives and saying, hey, how do you share with this match? And they shared very differently than me. And so we figured out. So he is my mother's half sibling. And they become a wonderful part of our family. And I really attribute this to why I delved into genetic genealogy as a career, because it was just, you know, I learned a lot along the way and I just loved doing this. So there's Uncle Larry. So basically, I am a Jewish genetic genealogist, not because I am actually Jewish, but because I specialize in Jewish genealogy, and I specialize in DNA, and I specialize in DNA for Jews, which are all different things. And I am an admin of a Jewish DNA group on Facebook. How that happened was this lovely woman next to me here, Jennifer Mendelson, said one day, hey, Adina, want to be admin in the group with me? And I said, sure. And we have also Lara Diamond, who's a well-known Jewish genetic genealogist also. And so we kind of started, we are the admin of a group that has, you know, I think, 13,000 people? I'm not sure. So we help people with their DNA quandaries, because as Scott kind of alluded to in the beginning, I'm very active on social media. Part of that activity is me helping people as what was called a search angel. So I learned almost everything I knew about genetic genealogy from being online. It was my education in a group called DNA Detectives. If you're familiar with CC Moore, it's her kind of baby. So I learned everything, and I supplemented with other blogs and books to learn. And I learned based on my own matches and really digging in and helping people more about the nuances of Jewish genetic genealogy. So I started helping people. And basically one day, I don't know what brought this on, but I called Jennifer and I said, it was probably something to do with law enforcement cases with identifying, unidentified remains, which is another volunteering job I do. I said, Jennifer, is there anything out there that gets these DNA kits into the hands of Holocaust survivors? Because why aren't we doing this more? We should be doing this all the time. And she said, no, there isn't, but I've been thinking about the same thing. So do you want to do it together? And I said, yeah. So that's when we teamed up to put our skill set together to help the Holocaust survivor community. Jennifer had already been working on cases like this. She also has, she actually got into genealogy in the first place, helping family. She tells this story very well about helping her husband's grandmother, who was a survivor, find first cousins in the US. So, you know, we both entered this differently, but we both committed to the same mission. And how it went is because of, you know, our world, and Jewish genealogy world has a lot of activity on places like Facebook. So I don't know if anyone is familiar with the BBC show DNA Family Secrets, but they told one day Jackie's story. This is Jackie Young. He's an adorable little boy. And basically the show talked about his quest to find the identity of his biological father. Now, Jackie was a child survivor of Theresienstadt, but and he ended up in the UK. He was rescued and he was adopted and raised by a family there. He always knew he was adopted, but not until he went to get married to get his papers did he realize he was not born in the UK, but he was born in Vienna. So nobody wanted to tell him that he was a survivor. So he had his birth certificate, and I'll show you that shortly. And he did not know it had a mother, but it did not have a father. So he spent much of his life with his wife trying to identify who his biological father was. And of course, as you know, he wondered, how did he survive when so many did not? He wondered if, in fact, his father might be a Nazi. And so he was on this show. I'm hoping you guys can hear this. Let me know if you can't.
It's the stuff of nightmares to find out that I'm not English. These are my parents, and I came from a concentration camp. I was adopted by two loving people. We never got kisses like they do today, but I knew they loved me. But the big bombshell was when I was just about to get married to meet her. I had to prove that I was Jewish to get married in a synagogue. And they said, you're going to have papers to prove it. And my mother had. Yeah. So that's when I found that horrible news.
Jackie's parents had hidden an awful truth. That as a young Jewish orphan in Vienna, the Gestapo had sent Jackie to a Nazi concentration camp called Theresienstadt.
It was a holding camp for sending people to Auschwitz.
The result was really clear. You are coming back as 99% Ashkenazi Jewish. So we think almost certainly your father was not a Nazi.
So I show that part. It's a very good episode you can find on YouTube. But, you know, everybody in our world was watching this. And we, you know, read some of it and basically, oh, I'm trying to get to the next page. So, you know, here are some of the records. This is the birth record I mentioned. You can see his mother was listed as Elsa, and you can see they put Sarah there. The Nazis would do that to Jewish women. They put Israel for men, so that's crossed out here. But Elsa Spiegel, and it is blank for the father, and he was born as Jonah. So, you know, it made big news, as we said. This was in the Times of Israel. The UK Family Roots TV show reassures Holocaust survivor that his father was not a Nazi, and this was in May 2022. You can also see in the second line, BBC show also finds cousins for man who never knew he had any relatives. And this is a screenshot of Jackie being introduced to relatives on his father's side. So, you know, for most people, this is heartwarming. Oh, they found Jackie cousins. For me and my partner, the question was, how are they cousins? How are they related? Who's the father? So that was what was being asked in the genealogy group. And as I mentioned, Jennifer and I are admin of a group, and of course, not just Jewish genealogy, but Jewish geography. Somebody in the group said, oh, my parents are neighbors with Jackie. And we said, can you put us in touch? And they did. And so we approached Jackie and said, hey, Jackie, you know, we saw your story. We're not really understanding what happened here because they introduced you to the paternal relatives, but who's your father? We can help you with that. Just give us your DNA. And he said, sure. You know, he's been trying for decades to figure out his identity. So if you have any familiarity with DNA matches, you'll know that these aren't great. These were his best matches on Ancestry. And one of them, I believe, is even what we would consider endogamous because the segments are so small. I can't remember which one, but that means that there's going to be no way we're tracing how he's related. So these are the best matches. These are, as you can see, they say second to third cousin. That's at best. They're mostly third to fourth cousins. So that's what we started with. And, you know, we were nervous. Fortunately for us, his father side had many more matches than the mother's side. And as I said, it's not really as much about DNA because that only takes us so far. It's about lots and lots of records. So, you know, we quickly realized that he was indeed introduced to paternal relatives. But what we noticed was that we think they were off by a generation. So they were saying something like second cousins, and we believe they were closer to second cousins once removed, third cousins. What we started to notice was there was this prevalence of the last name Kornfein in his matches, which is not a super common name. He had quite a few Kornfein matches. And we also noticed some Sussmans as well. So we started to dig into the records. And fortunately, Vienna has a lot of lovely records. And we found a marriage record of a Kornfein, Jacob Kornfein, to Frida Sussman. I think they were from Lockenbach, which is in Hungary. But they were married in Vienna. So we have this record, and we believed, you know, we did all our DNA work, and based on what was the most likely match, is that Jackie descended from this couple. What I'm not showing also is if you are familiar with DNA, 23andMe has a feature called haplogroups, maternal and paternal. I mentioned that we only do autosomal DNA primarily, but paternal haplogroups are the kind of what you get for your Y DNA. So your father's, the patrilineal side, and you know it's better for deep ancestry. And then the maternal is mtDNA, mitochondrial DNA, the mother's mother. So Jackie actually had, we don't usually use haplogroups with Jewish genealogy because, for example, 40% of Ashkenazi Jews all have the same 4 haplogroups. So you can lead to some bad conclusions, but there was a not so common paternal haplogroup we saw for somebody with the last name Kornfein. So we felt very confident we were in the right place. So we thought we'd look for a descendant of this couple based on the DNA matches. And we were looking for a son, and there were only 2 sons that we could find. Again, sometimes absence of evidence doesn't mean, you know, there could be another son that we just didn't have a record for, but this is what we felt comfortable with. So you can see there's some sisters. So Shlomo Kornfein was not in the right place at the right time. And we actually found some descendants of him since who tested, but he was in France at the time of Jackie's birth. So we felt it was very unlikely it was him. But then there was this gentleman named Adolf Kornfein, and we started to dig into him. And what we learned is we had an address for him, and I popped it into Google Maps, and he lived a 7-minute walk from Jackie's mother. So we felt pretty confident based on the DNA matches and the 7-minute walk that we found the father. But you can't just go based on that. You have to get some confirmation. What we did learn, however, is that Jackie's parents, because we did find that Adolf Kornfein was his father, were on the same transport to Mali Trostenitz, which was a killing center basically, they were on the same one, which, you know, Jackie actually finds some peace with that, knowing that they were together. We don't know the status of the relationship. They were not married, and but you know, he found that out. So as we were searching for Adolf's family, you know, you find really random records as you do this. So you might have seen that there was a sister of Adolf named Cornelia. Cornelia converted to Christianity well before the Holocaust. And this is her, we saw the giant cross and it kind of took us aback, but this is her obituary. And so Jackie has some, you know, this was in Hungary, has some, you know, cousins in Hungary somewhere. And again, we didn't, ethically speaking, we didn't know if we wanted to rock their boat. We have no idea if they know that they're a descendant of someone who's Jewish. So, you know, this was one person that we found. And you find, again, so many different types of records when you do this. This is also a reminder when you look, again, I mentioned, look at the whole document. So you can see this has to do with Samuel Kornfein. He's from Lachenbach. He was the child of Jacob and Frida. Again, remember I mentioned that there was the other son. So a lot of times people just focus on the person itself, but I really encourage you, look at the person who's filling it out. And it was Armand Kornfein in Lyon, France, who was his son, Fils. So we now know that that he had a son that survived. He did testimony for his parents in France, and we found a descendant of his to test. We also found at the same time Jennifer was on the beach, and MyHeritage has different databases, and they said, check out this Vienna immigration records database. And so Jennifer pops in Kornfein, because that's where they were at the time, and they found Adolf's record. And it tells us a little bit more about himself, that he's a Schneider, which is tailor, and his exact birth date and everything. But we go to the second page, and we also find that when he was filling this out, he actually was married and he had a son. Unfortunately, you know, we have to only assume that he and his wife, because his address was different than the wife's at the time, that they were separated, but both his, you know, ex-wife, separated wife, whatever, and the son, who would have been Jackie's half-brother, perished at Auschwitz. So we, you know, we had to deliver that information to Jackie. So what's really important to understand about this is Jennifer and I effectively figured out our candidate in 4 days, but it did not take 4 days to finalize this. You know, we were very, very scared because you got to get somebody to test for you to confirm your theory. So we found one individual, only one individual in the entire US to test for us, because there's no other descendants. And I remember, I don't know if we did like a rocks, paper, scissors, shoot kind of situation, but I'm the one who ended up calling this gentleman. And you can imagine how some of these phone calls go, because if somebody calls you and say, hi, I'm a genealogist, and, you know, I need you to test because I think you are a first cousin once removed to a survivor. I mean, it's extraordinary, but people are very suspicious. So we've met that plenty of times. So I called, and I remember him answering, and it wasn't the best connection, but I started to tell my story, and it was just crickets. I said, oh no, I blew it. He's going to hang up on me. He said, oh, sorry, hold on. Let me go outside. Bad connection. So he goes outside, and he says, of course, I'll take a DNA test. He's the father of adopted children, so he understands how important this is. And then after that phone call, he gets the test. I think we overnighted it to him in St. Louis. 5 weeks it took for the test to come back, and they match as a 401, which is typical of a first cousin once removed. We found another first cousin once removed in France based on what we saw. They took MyHeritage, and she also matched accordingly. So we, you know, felt pretty confident that we had Jackie's father. And this is us telling Jackie the news and this lovely, lovely wife, Lita. We love them very much. And this was all back in 2022. And after that, the Times of Israel wrote a really lovely article on the work Jennifer and I had done. We like being called the Jewish genealogist duo. We feel like we sound like superheroes. And we decided, you know, they did such a nice job with the Jackie story before, let's give them the rest of it. So you can see that if you Google Jackie Young in Times of Israel, you could probably find this article. And so Jennifer and I actually, for the first time, you know, we worked for years together. We hadn't met in person until last year at the Jewish Genealogical Conference in London. And part of the perk of that was Jackie lives in London. So we had met them for lunch, and that was kind of the highlight for us. So it was a big reunion for all of us, and they are as lovely as we knew they are, and they continue to still be very lovely. So that was the Jackie story. And then, you know, of course, a genealogist never sleeps with this. You know, you got to keep going. And we have the Polish Jewish sister story. So again, Jennifer and I generated a lot of our casework from stories we were seeing in the news that didn't tell the whole story. So here are two sisters, Helena and Christina. Now, Helena and Christina knew that they were orphaned. They were, you know, Polish Catholic, I believe. And they were abandoned in summer of 1941 in Poland. So their granddaughter said to them, hey, grannies, you know what? You were abandoned. Was always some whispers around. Maybe there's something going on here. Take a 23andMe test. So they both took 23andMe test. The first thing they learned is you see them as sisters here, but they never knew about each other. So the test found that they were full sisters. And so they just met for the first time in this photo. Secondly, they're 100% Ashkenazi Jewish. So they were abandoned because to save their life. So it means something very, very different than they grew up to believe. So of course we saw this, and Jennifer and I said, hey, we want to find your biological parents. And the granddaughters were very excited by this prospect. And again, it's really amazing the things you can find. The matches, some were better than others. And I like to tell a story about that, but we just, again, jumped into the records. Jennifer and I have a partnership in our program with JRI Poland, which is, they basically hold all the Jewish Polish records or know how to access them. And so they give us records, part of our partnership. But this is a record of a Nachman Nachmanowitz, which is one of my favorite names, and Esther Jacobowitz. I think the marriage is from 1854, and they had lots of kids, and we were tracing every single line and getting spreadsheets and spreadsheets from JRI Poland to find one of the sides of the family. And, you know, people always say, oh, like, I'd love to watch you and Jennifer work. I mean, it's really not that interesting usually. I'm usually sitting and scrolling, and I have 100 tabs open on my, you know, laptop until it crashes, and then I do it again. And sometimes you send messages at 12:48 in the morning, and, you know, Jennifer said, you know, we had Hirsch Moshek's wife, we had all these names, and she sent me the marriage, and that's a lot of this. You know, this is the, you know, the G version. There's a lot of other things that we say when we get really excited. But, you know, we basically are trying to bring DNA matches together and tie them in a bow to figure out who the parents are. And I'd like to say that since then, we have figured out who their parents are. We don't know their fates, but we have linked them to a second cousin on their mother's side, and they have living first cousins in Israel. Right on their father's side, we're still trying to figure kind of the logistics there too with some reunions. But again, we gave them back their family names. So Jennifer and I officially took this concept to the Center for Jewish History, and our pilot launched at the end of 2022. We had a whole our kickoff was Jennifer is related, if you've read The Lost, that is Jennifer's brother, Daniel Mendelsohn. So he moderated for us very kindly, and we were up and running, even though we had already been doing this. We had some seed money from the center, and we kept working. We set up a portal because part of our mission, as we said, was to get DNA kits in the hands of as many survivors and their children as possible. So we had people submitting their stories, and they are each one, you know, you kind of develop a thick skin for a lot of it because it's very hard, but this is an example of a typical submission. After that, my father and myself, with my 4 other siblings, were sent off in cattle cars to Auschwitz. Once we arrived there, I was separated from my father and younger brother and would never see them again. Our heads were shaved, and then Dr. Mengele did the selection. I was sent in one line, and my 3 other sisters were sent to the other line. That would be the last time that I would ever see them again. In Auschwitz, I found 2 of my cousins that were still alive. We stayed together and survived about 5 different concentration camps, death marches, being beaten, starved, disease in the freezing cold winter months. We were finally liberated from Bergen-Belsen in April 1945. After we were liberated, I looked to find anyone from my family, but unfortunately I didn't find anyone. But I still have hope that maybe there's a cousin out there that did survive and that is still alive. I hope with your assistance that you will help me find them. So we get a lot of this. And it's very humbling. It can be very overwhelming, but it really inspires us to try to give them something back because so much was taken away. During all of this, at first, we had sort of part of the seed money was to buy kits, but Ancestry caught wind of what we were doing and donated 2,500 kits to the program at that time. So, we had a lot of opportunity to give out kits. And with that, our first case in the pilot was a individual, and this is a common refrain. So, I showed you a couple fantastical stories in a way, of a hidden child, of a child who didn't know his father's name, of 2 sisters who were abandoned. That is not your typical case. Your typical case is somebody who is a survivor or a child of a survivor who thinks that they are the only one who lived. They know their family tree, or at least the bare bones of it, or they know an uncle survived. They know something. So it's not a hidden child situation. But, this survivor, she'd been telling her story for years. She was the only one left in her family. Nobody else. She tested through the program and she got a 340 centimorgan match. As you can see, that's a second cousin range match. And she had no idea who this person was. So this is the very first person who got in touch with us after they tested. And she didn't know who they were because she didn't know her grandmother had an older brother who immigrated to the US in the 19-teens and had a whole family. So a lot of times DNA brings people together that didn't even know they should be looking for somebody. So she has this whole other line that was in the US, a second cousin. And again, sometimes people poo-poo, second, third cousin, but for people who lost everything and everybody, having somebody that you're connected to like that can mean the world. So, this is kind of the typical case we get, second to third cousin, but we find something or we find records. And then, we also have to warn people, people say, what are the drawbacks of taking a test? And I say the biggest, people come up with lots of reasons that they get nervous, but the biggest thing I've ever seen is that you might find out something that, you're surprised to find. So this is a 1,077 centimorgan match. You can see the types of relationships that is. This was a Holocaust survivor's test to somebody. The person that they were matching had passed away, but she was adopted and only 50% Jewish and did not know her biological father. So our Holocaust survivor matched as a first cousin to this person. Our survivor knew that they had an uncle living in England. The other ones were all in other places. So we figured out the uncle, who had no other children that we knew of, probably fathered this child, and surprise, they have a first cousin. And even though that cousin has passed away, their children, as you can see, were happy. Promised, dear Adina, this was after a conversation through the funeral service. They had requested the obituary. We contacted the daughter. She was very eager to hear about her unknown grandfather. Quote, a grandfather that we never had the chance to meet. Sadly, mom was searching for over 30 years to find her father. She sadly passed without knowing. And they said, you can add this to your list of reunions. So again, the survivor in this case did not care that their uncle, had some child somewhere, went up for adoption. They had new family. And that was very, very exciting for them. Also, I love some of the stories we get. So this survivor, she had a surname. She knew nobody who survived on that line. And unfortunately, in her case, this was, I believe, in Warsaw, and the records were just decimated. So we weren't building as many trees, but she uploaded to MyHeritage, and she found a solid second cousin match with that rare surname. And, based on, we don't have the tree perfect, but we know they're second cousins, and they actually met in Paris, and they sent me this photo. And he said something like, a cousin suddenly fell out of the sky. So, again, we brought this person, a family member they never knew about, they thought the surname was completely wiped out. And here we have some, gentleman walking around with this name who happened to test on MyHeritage. We also find that every story is different. It's unique, needs to be told. So one of my favorite cases that we've had was a gentleman came to us on behalf of his survivor mother. She's still living in Israel. And there was some skepticism about the family story. So the story was that his mother and her mother, they kind of hid with, they had pseudonyms during the war. They hid as, Polish. They weren't Jews. They had different names, everything. So the story was that the mother married her first cousin, and that the survivor was the child of them, but he died. He was murdered during the Holocaust. But again, things didn't necessarily add up. One of my favorite parts of the story is once, I guess, the survivor's child showed to his grandmother, hey, like, who's in this photo that he had found? He said, oh, that's your kid. You tell that's your grandfather. And he's thinking, that doesn't look like the grandfather that I've seen pictures of. So she tested the survivor, and she was 50% Jewish and 50% Eastern European Polish. That cousin story was not true. It was a Polish man was the father. They had hired a genealogist who did some remarkable work before, because they figured out the names that they had assumed during the war. And they found it connected to some gentleman, and they looked at property records and all this, and they had a name. We decided to look into it. Again, Jennifer and I specialize in Jewish genealogy, but this was a Holocaust survivor. We weren't going to say no to this. If you are, not 100% Jewish and anything else, you might find that your Jewish matches basically crowd out all of your other matches. So on MyHeritage, you can actually sort right now by ethnicity. So we just sorted by Eastern European, and this was the closest match that was not Jewish. And it's not a huge match, 60 centimorgans, largest 17, but you can see they have a tree, and that tree happened to have the name of the person that they thought, like the family name that they thought could be the biological father. And so what we did in this case is we hired a genealogist on the ground in Poland to look for marriage record or birth record for the assumed names. And they found not only the marriage record of the survivor's parents, who she was married to a Polish man, but they found her birth record with the original last name. So she has her actual original birth certificate now as well. So again, every story has a different flavor to it. And I really enjoyed this because this was a little bit different. And really, there are just so many stories left to tell. We were covered in the Washington Post last December about the work we do. In this case, sometimes we give even records. So the survivor and his daughter, their survivor tested, and, a lot of times, I think children just remember their parents as mom and dad. So he had a name for them, his mother. Well, we found his parents' marriage record, and it had a slightly different name for the mother. And it was like we gave them $1 million, because they just couldn't believe you found a marriage record that, they always lived with the understanding that everything was destroyed. There was nothing left to be had. And we united them with some other relatives, but just this marriage record of his parents, her grandparents, was everything to them. And that's what we try to give back. So there's just so many stories. I mean, I'm working on other stories right now. And so you saw, Scott first mentioned the DNA Reunion Project. That was our pilot, but we are now an independent entity. Jennifer and I, it's called the Holocaust Reunion Project. We have a website. You can email us at info@holocaustreunions.org. And we are still doing the same work. We kind of started up in May again, but we officially relaunched at IHE, the Jewish Genealogy Conference, at the end of August. So we're kind of fresh there. And our mission is threefold. Again, it's getting DNA kits in the hands of Holocaust survivors and their children. We have an in-kind donation from Ancestry. So we primarily give kits free of charge from Ancestry. We provide genealogical services to all survivors and their children. The timing's going to vary. Everyone gets a minimum of 3 hours, but we spend for unknown parentage cases for survivors, we will exhaust every resource until we get as far as we can. So survivors are always at the top of our list, but everybody who is eligible can have 3 hours of our services. And usually that's just, hey, I got my DNA results back. Can you make heads or tails of this for me? Any match is worth looking at. And then finally, and kind of why I'm here right now, is we want to really educate people about the possibilities of DNA testing and how to interpret some of your DNA results. And just a reminder that the records weren't all destroyed. There are scores and scores, thousands, millions. Some of them are easily accessible online. Some of them you have to know what archives to look at, but there's almost always something to find. And that's what we're doing. And we're just kind of trying to, reunite people with not only family, but their history, because not only was their family stolen, but their history was stolen, like as I just mentioned with that marriage record. So that is the work we do. I'm happy to answer any questions now. Our website, again, I'm also Adina at Holocaust Reunions, if you want to reach out to me individually. And then as Scott said, I'm all over social media as My Family Jeannie, but also the organization's account is Holocaust Reunion Project on Instagram, and you can find it on Facebook as well. So,
Wow, thank you. Will you take us off share so we can see everything?
yes.
So I will start. I do have a question, and that,
Okay.
so obviously you're getting this information to the families. Is it also stored in some type of archival situation too, meaning that so that others, if they wanted to access this, as far as like updating, let's see, the Yad Vashem victims information, the museum in DC. I mean, what's happening past the family?
So what happens is typically it's up to the families. Again, somebody takes an ancestry test. Jennifer and I have no access to that test unless the family, gives us access, and there's an informed consent process. We basically create trees for people on Ancestry. And I can tell you that the US Holocaust Museum, for example, when you ask them to do a search, they are using Ancestry and MyHeritage and bringing up things. I know personally that they're doing that because they've done it. And it was actually very funny the other day because I was looking at somebody on MyHeritage and it said this name and last name. I was like, wow, that sounds really familiar. Why is this person looking for a person? And I was like, oh, Dodds, the archivist at the US Holocaust Museum. And I just didn't think of his name. So, it's up to the families. Sometimes we make them private at first, especially for hidden children, because people can get very spooked. But a lot of times we at least make them accessible so people can find them. But, we're working on, and we've spoken to every Holocaust organization at this point, every museum, the State Department, the JCC in Krakow. Like, we've spoken to lots and lots of people, so they're made aware of what we're doing and hoping to partner with them. The federations, so.
Great. Any other questions? Adina, this is just simply amazing and so needed. It just
I mean, what I want to say here is if any of you have not tested an Ancestry and you are a survivor or a second generation, please reach out to us and we will get you a free kit. There are plenty of people that just want the kit and we never hear from them again, and that's totally fine. It's up to you, but we're also happy to help as well. It's kind of your choice. And if you've already tested Ancestry, we can also give you instructions for how to upload to a site like MyHeritage, which takes free transfers.
Wonderful.
Oh.
Thank you so much. Unbelievable. Just amazing. It's great to reconnect with you this way, and your work is just fabulous.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
And I'd just like to say in a wrap up here, Shana Tova Tekatevu. We're about to enter the high holidays, so Happy New Year to all of us. Because of the holidays, the next third Thursday is actually the first day of Sukkot. So we will be back together in November. And at that point, we're going to look at a new series of graphic novels that are coming out from the Illinois Holocaust Center. So Adina, thank you again. And I will see all of you, I hope, in 2 months.